there's one at Westmead called Sydney West, and then there's a couple of units.
Thanks to Lena and Robin and the team from the TCRN for inviting myself and my colleague, and I'd just like to introduce my colleague because she was even later than I was, but not sure what her excuse is, but I'm sure we're here. Nicole Hennicourt, and Nicole's the project officer who's basically really been the powerhouse for actually implementing the Cancer Research Challenge, which I will speak to you about a little bit at the end of this presentation. Nicole's actually going to spend the rest of the day with you, and unfortunately I'll need to leave you. Now, in some ways I turned up, I thought in my diary it said 10 o'clock to turn up, so it was good for me to actually sit in and hear about what, some of the issues around the TCRN and their vision for you as PhDs. And I noticed from the information that's sent out was that you are, you sound like you're really sort of very much working at the T1 level, so you're very much probably doing basic science or in the clinical research. And for someone like myself who's a nurse and essentially spends my day, which I'm delighted to say, caring for patients and families with many sorts of cancers and usually at the end of life, to think about the work that you are undertaking in the lab is kind of interesting. But I also want to go back to the point that Lena made with regards to why it's important for you to think about the end users of the product that you're essentially developing, or the line of inquiry that you're following in the lab. And from my rudimentary understanding of basic science and lab work is that you will follow many lines of inquiry and you'll be working as part of a big team. And some of that is actually going to lead to wonderful discoveries, and others may lead you somewhere that may not be totally apparent initially what that new knowledge is going to do, but ultimately someone may come back to it and build on the work. But I would really encourage you, whenever you have these opportunities with the TCRN, to actually really come out of the lab and think about who is actually going to be the end user for your product. Because ultimately, research is really expensive, and the research that you're undertaking, even at your level and as part of a bigger team, has to actually be funded. And increasingly, getting funding for research, and I'm sure you know this, is really, really competitive, and it's really quite tough. I sit on National Health and Medical Research Council research panel reviews, but you'll be pleased to know I don't review lab work. But I think one of the key messages that comes out of when you're sitting on those panels to review is really, so what, who cares? What actually, what difference is this big investment going to make to the end outcome for Australians? And at the end of the day, for me, it's actually around our patients and our families. So what I want to do is really build upon the foundation that Lena has started to lay with regards to translational research. And being a good, or trying to be a good academic, I'm following the brief that I was given. So when I said yes, on the hop, I was asked to actually give you an introduction to translational cancer research, to provide you with and I thought it'd be helpful, and to provide you with some of the definitions. And Lena's put up a figure which helps to think a conceptual framework of translational research and the different stages, 1, 2, 3. I've got a couple of other models. There's multiple models for all of you who are into just surfing the web. If you just go to translational research models, you will be inundated. And then I want to provide you some operational definitions. Given that I've declared my lack of knowledge around the lab, probably most of my presentation is really going to focus very much down probably T3 end of the discussion. Okay, so I just sort of wanted to set the context of translational research. So it's a fairly recent term, and in actual fact, when you start looking back into the literature, it's sort of mooted quite early. A lot of the nursing literature actually talks about the concept of, but they don't actually call it translational research. Nursing in the 70s and 80s was actually saying we really need to use the research that we're generating, or the knowledge that we're generating in research in a more in a more robust way, and really start to take notice of it. But it's actually become really much more prominent, I think, really since the turn of the millennium. And And I guess at the very basic level, it describes the steps between a fundamental discovery and its application to clinical medicine. So even the work, and I'm sorry I missed out hearing all of your PhD projects, the work that you're exploring, if it is successful at some level, is actually going to impact on clinical medicine, the way in which we care for people. So it really it's really an involvement about moving knowledge going from the basic sciences. So you folk all play a really critical role in translational research. But it's actually, how do we actually get that out into the clinical setting? And how do we actually get that out into the community? So I guess when we first started talking about translational research, many papers and people in conversation would talk about it from bench to bedside. So most of you, put up your hand, most of you understand what you would call bench researchers. Is that a thing? Yep. Is anyone at the bedside other than myself? That's right. Was good for, what was that?
I'm at neither.
Oh, where are you?
I'm more of the sociological.
Oh, okay.
So I'm looking at the network as a
okay, so you're sort of more out in the community, perhaps, or thinking of the bigger picture. Yeah. And we'll talk about that, because that's a really important part of translational research and an area that we're really starting to identify. And I guess for people like myself, I think a lot of what I'm really doing is trying to get the evidence from the bookshelf, because we've got a lot of evidence on the bookshelf, out to the bedside. And there's also the potential for developing our new research paradigm. So that's just sort of to set the scene. So just when we broadly conceptualise about research, I think at a very rudimentary level, there's potentially, three types of research. So we've got basic research, which is pretty much just research for knowledge's sake, exploring something. It doesn't necessarily involve people, it's all actually in the lab. Then we've got clinical research, it's really very much about involving people. And then we've got this whole new emerging area of translational research. And I've put some other types of research that I think are really fall underneath translational research. And I think, given that this is an evolving paradigm, and the issue around knowledge translation, implementation, dissemination and program science, which I think is really what Janet is talking about, that big picture type of research that we need to do to make an impact at a population level, that they really fall under this very broad umbrella term called translational research. Well, that's how I conceive of it anyway. So this is a definition for translational research, and this is sort of one of the earlier definitions that appeared in JAMA, which is a very prestigious medical journal, in 2002. So, there are some, what are the similarities between that definition and the TCRN definition? What are the key things that are similar or reflected in both? Are there any similarities?
Translating the basic research to the clinical settings, basically.
Yep. And it's that's an important thing. But what about which part of, I guess, often in cancer we talk about a cancer journey, and if you've looked at the National Service Improvement Framework for Cancer, which you may not have, but we actually talk about preventing cancer, finding cancer early, active treatment, care after treatment, and then end-of-life care. And we would call that sort of like a journey. So translational research is really applicable at all levels of that, from prevention, finding cancer early, which is probably some of the work that many of you are actually doing in the lab, then active treatment, which I'm sure many of you are working on treatment modalities or new treatment modalities, and then also moving on into the area that I'm most familiar with in terms of end-of-life or palliative care. And I think the other key thing was this is in 2002, that this was actually seen as being totally essential for improving health. But what you're probably starting to get a sense of, and I thought this was quite a good quote that sums it up, that really translational research means different things to different people, but it seems to be important to almost everyone. So I think your idea of translational research when you're working in the lab will be somewhat different to mine working with patients and families in clinical settings, be that in acute hospitals or be that in the community or in doctor's surgeries, or for Janice, who's actually working at a much broader population level. So this was an article, these sort of terms come from an article from Academic Medicine in 2010, where they provide their definition of translational research, which here it's a variation on this theme. So we see that it's multi-directional, and I'll come and talk to you about that, I'll come back to that in a moment, that it's very much multidisciplinary. It actually acknowledges the role of basic science, but it's actually saying that it's really patient-orientated research with that long-term aim of improving the health of the public. So it actually acknowledges that there's really, at this point, about two components, and it's actually about how we actually apply lab-based knowledge to the development of trials and studies in humans, but also too, how do we actually get research which is really enhanced at the adoption of best evidence-based practice. And for me, that's actually where the TCRN have funded the project that I'm working on, in partnership with a multidisciplinary team of colleagues across multiple sites, to actually improve the way in which we as cancer and palliative care clinicians care for people who've actually got pain. I think one of the really big things about why this has become such an issue at this time is that the lead time from developing evidence to getting it into practice is just huge. So in essence, it takes about 17 years to turn 14%. So 14% of all the research that's done that actually ends up being applicable to actually end up being of benefit for the patient, patient care. And I guess the thing is, the question for me is, can we actually afford to wait that long? And I would suggest to you, we can't. Can anybody think of a recent example of where it's taken 17 years to get evidence into practice, and it's evidence that started in a lab in Australia that has been recognised at the highest level in the world and awarded? HPV is one of them, yeah, but there's another one. But HPV is a great example. Go back, 1983, resulted in a Nobel laureate for medicine. Yeah, yeah. So, you said, yeah. So, I think that the work of Barry Marshall and Robin Warren is a really good example of where that was actually quite robust evidence that got a Lancet publication in 1983, and it did not get translated into evidence-based practice guidelines for 17 years. And I guess the question that I, as a clinician and a taxpayer, ask myself is, how many patients have we subjected to unnecessarily interventions who've ended up having adverse side effects, just the morbidity associated with their disease burden and lost work time, not to mention the stress and expense for the family. So I would say, and this is probably one of the most critical issues in health, because we actually know in the healthcare setting, without any of you bright young things finding any more discoveries, if we actually implemented what we know today in healthcare, then in actual fact we'd make a huge impact on both morbidity and mortality. And there's a quote there from the Director of Clinical Knowledge, and it's quite an old quote and it's quite